Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management webinar series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen. I'm the program manager for the Recycling Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. Today's topic is titled Climate Pollution Reduction Grants for Materials Management. And our presenters today are Jay Bassett and Christine Kubat, who I will introduce in a moment. After their presentations, we will have a Q&A session. So if you have a question or comment, please use the Q&A feature located on your control panel on your screen. And please note that an edited version of the webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. I'm going to introduce our presenters now. Our first presenter is Jay Bassett. He's an expert on asset-based community development and a former advisor for the US EPA Region 4, who's currently working on as a volunteer with Keep Georgia Beautiful Foundation, Gwinnett Clean and Beautiful, Sustainable Gwinnett, and the Life Cycle Building Center. He's also a member of the Steering Council for the Atlanta Archdiocese Laudato SI Initiative, Creation Care co-chair at St. John Newman in Lilburn, Georgia, an advisor with Georgia Interfaith Power and Lights, and a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby. So Jay, you're on.
Great, I appreciate the opportunity to come here and share. So hopefully, Wayne, the presentation is showing. I just resumed sharing. Good. So anyway, as Wayne had mentioned, I'm retired from EPA, but maybe a little bit more about my connection here. One was, back in the early days of the National Recycling Coalition and Sustainable Materials Management, I was the Region 4 Sustainable Materials Management Chief, and then also spent a few years or a year and a half as EPA's principal advisor and national expert for recycling and materials management in the 2016, 2017, and then wrapped up my career as an advisor on what we call EPA's community-driven solutions framework, or what is now Community Works, which we now see embedded in EPA's Executive Order 14,008, known also as the Justice 40 for community-based development. So as I retired from the agency after July of 2021, I've been spending a lot of my time really working on and looking at this idea of circular economic development at the community level through community organizations that provide circular cities to support city zero waste and waste reduction goals through those kind of assets. And for example, here in Atlanta, these are things like Center for Hard to Recycle Materials that do drop-off programs that can't otherwise go into curbside. Another one is the Life Cycle Building Center for reusing building materials that reinvest that back into communities, or the thriving, what we call truly living well around composting, local agricultural, and community-based composting. So the idea is community organizations as part of circular infrastructure. So as part of that, and part of before I retired from the agency, I got to work on and really build out what was under the Justice 40 of how do we build and support community-based organizations to be able to build the capacity and get the technical assistance and maybe some easier grants that they can access to build capacity to be able to access some of the broader funding that's coming down underneath some of the, back then it was Build Back Better, which then got codified in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so from my perspective, I've always been interested in really tracking and looking at building infrastructure and recycling infrastructure, reuse infrastructure, decarbonization infrastructure around our Inflation Reduction Act funding for climate and climate action has been where I've been focused. So that's what we're going to kind of dive into today. And this is where you see it reflected in this chart. So back in February, I'm also part of the Air Advance program, which is another voluntary program within EPA's AIR program that works with community, states, and locals, mostly local and community folks, on addressing air and air quality issues, and a voluntary program they pushed out this chart, which was really interesting. This was the first time I've seen, as you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, where EPA was trying to present, if you look at the circle in the middle, as a city or as a community, how some of the different Inflation Reduction Act programs around climate that the agency manages comes together in a more coordinated way into an investment stack. And this was the initial presentation in February. And they say, well, why February? Well, in early March, they pushed out the guidance for the climate pollution planning and implementation grants, the climate pollution reduction grants. And as it turns out, everyone thinks, well, those are just grants, so let's just talk about it from a grant perspective. But it was actually a relatively a pretty big significant policy lever. And kind of where I'm going to guide you through today is to show you how that really is an opportunity for material management infrastructure that goes beyond and can be also done in coordination with the solid waste infrastructure and recycling grants, the SWIFR program that came through some other legislation. So what you see here from the AIR program, though you won't see any land-based programs on there, and I'll tell you why here in a minute, but what you'll see is where the agency was trying to articulate that it's working across, within the agency in a coordinated way, but also interagency of doing what they call bottom-up development at the local and community level to build capacity to deliver good projects. And those projects are funded through what they call the top-down, which is the climate pollution reduction grants, which those grants and that preliminary guidance came out in March. And the implementation grants, which I'll touch on here in a minute, will become available for funding out of the $4.6 billion fund out of that IRA program starting in January of 2024. I did want you to note also, for those that might have an interest, that from the agency perspective, that there are other programs that they're looking at a climate perspective. One is the methane emissions reduction program, which some folks here might have an interest in, which is really more of a regulatory effort on sector-based work, as well as the mobile sources such as the Clean Bus program for those that are interested, where you can actually get rebates for school systems to buy clean buses. And that directly connects up to the Department of Energy and their Clean Cities Coalition, which is around supporting EV infrastructure as part of community development work. Also want to recognize that there are other interagency partners at the table. There is an interagency coordination council that looks at other programs that can be brought to the table to support the decarbonization transformation that the climate pollution reduction grants represent. One of them is the USDA Rural Partner Network that brings in a bunch of USDA money, particularly for rural communities, as well as the Department of Energy State and Community Energy Program, SCEP, which is the individual incentives and rebates, as well as workforce development funding around clean energy. So with that, what I'm going to do is first is kind of give you a preview of the bottom-up work, and then we'll do the top-down, and then we'll connect those together from a sustainable material management perspective. So on the EJ block grant, so what I want you to kind of take away from this is that's a $2.8 billion fund, and that the other thing, it says a 3-year program. So you'll notice there that most of these programs, that the funding must be awarded by September of 2026. That includes the other broader climate programs and climate action programs. So that means basically right now we're in May, and soon to be May of 2024. So you're talking about 24 to 30 months that this money has to be pushed out the door. So what I'm telling you is there's going to be a whole lot of activity starting, and that's part of what the climate pollution reduction grant set up, of funding that's going to be coming down and targeted at the community level for community development, of which includes sustainable material management infrastructure and waste management activities as part of climate action. So the bottom-up EJ grants was the way when the agency was looking at being able to develop those good projects at the community level, was to put in place mechanisms to allow community-based organizations to build capacity, so that funding, which normally you think of a lot of this funding coming from the federal, state, and local level. A lot of this funding is going to go directly toward and working with community-based organizations. So it's a little bit different, or a second piece of how the Inflation Reduction Act mechanism is supposed to work, with the idea that 40% of all funding go to environmental justice communities, which means it has to go to community-based organizations. So under the environmental justice grants, the two that just closed, for example, what EPA did is took the existing programs and they did it with a twist, so that what they call the environmental justice government to government program that goes to local government states, they had to work in partnership with a community-based organization to develop a project to be eligible for $1 million in funding. They closed on April the 14th. And the other one was the Environmental Justice Collaborative Solving Grants Cooperative Agreement Program, which was directed, and the only primary applicant could be a community-based organization, or a community-based organization in partnership with each other, with other community-based organizations or institutions, higher ed institutions. So in this case, what the agency is encouraging is the building of coalitions between community-based organizations to work better together, and also better together with government, where they're co-creating, co-designing solutions with and in partnership with local government. And as we're going to talk about, with the big money coming down through the Climate Pollution Reduction Act and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that's a critical component of the strategy underneath the Inflation Reduction Act disbursement or grant strategies, as well as outputs. The second thing that was done, and EPA is not the only one, this is in partnership with Department of Energy, and DOT has their own. They set up a Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers program to provide technical support to community-based organizations, the capacity to be able to do what? Apply for grants at the federal level, at the community level, and build their capacity to be able to manage those things, both in terms of competitive applications as well as fiduciary requirements. The one change to this slide that was awarded 2 weeks ago. So if you go to the Communities Technical Assistance Centers Program website on EPA's Environmental Justice Grants, you will see that those centers are stood up and or have been awarded. There's one in each region, plus one that's a little bit broader on a national output that goes to a large NGOs and a number of partners. One of those partners is an organization I support, the Environmental Protection Network, which is a retired EPA folks providing technical assistance to communities. And their intent is to help them be competitive for and develop good projects for both the EJ grant program, but also the climate pollution grants themselves. The second one that's out right now is the Environmental Justice Thriving Communities grants. Or the Environmental Justice Thriving Communities grant makers, because again, the idea was to work with trusted entities, community-based organizations that represent communities. And they realized in order to build capacity, they need to have capacity building grants, because agency or federal grants don't usually do capacity building. So this is a grant program that's open right now, that's going to be with $550 million award, 50 million each, one in each region, that will be providing a phased series of small grants, assessment planning and project development grants to community-based organizations and coalitions to be able to develop projects for underneath one of the climate action plans. The last thing I would tell you, there is a future funding opportunity. The RFI is already closed, but what I want you to be aware of is that the agency is looking at pushing out that hasn't touched the 2.8 billion in grant money yet. I expect to see those start to pop out the end of May and June. The Thriving Communities grant makers and the TIC-TAC centers, the Technical Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers, are supposed to be working together to support communities. Then the bigger 2.8 billion to access that into doing in both environmental justice work as well as climate and climate action work that gets further funded through the next program I'm going to talk about. So that's the bottom up view. So next I'm going to talk about the top down. So on the top down, this is the climate pollution reduction grants. So the agency, as I said, put this out in March of 2023. And you'll notice in there's two pieces to it. There's the non-competitive planning grants and competitive implementation grants. The big pot of money everyone is chasing after is the 4.6 billion in competitive grants. But the non-competitive planning grants was what was I didn't expect to see, which is the real change to, I call the overall strategy the agency is taking in doing what? Well, to have and work with 50 states to develop what they call climate action plans. I'm going to walk you through that. Before I walk you through that, I want you to notice that under line 3, under the program objectives, it says transformative and scalable decarbonization efforts in key sectors, innovative policies and programs that scale across jurisdictions. So what I want you to think about, what the agency is saying is they're expecting local governments to work together to develop climate action plans at the metro level, as well as working with states underneath a statewide climate action plan. And those decarbonization efforts aren't just the typical clean energy programs. That decarbonization also includes decarbonization development around circularity, where we're actually looking at decarbonization of the material and consumption supply chains. So that is a key change as we look at climate action planning, that under these climate action plans I'm going to talk about, open the door for local governments and working with community-based organizations to develop projects that would be eligible for the 4.6 billion in competitive grants that will be coming available in January of 2024. So when we talk about the planning grant allocations, since these are non-competitive grants, that means the agency identified who gets them. So the way it played out was the agency identified, and that you can read some of the, if you want to call it political strategy underneath this, if you want to call it that way, or the policy pool that I'm talking about, that each of the largest 67 metropolitan areas as defined by the 2020 census, they call them MSAs, would each receive $1 million each to be able to do a climate action plan. And as part of that climate action plan, that if they accept the funding to do that, what they call a notice of intent to participate, and then develop a work plan that the agency and budget an application that the agency works with to finalize, that one of the outputs of those 67 largest cities, metro areas is a climate action priority plan that would be due by March of 2024. And that is how you become eligible for developing those projects that's fundable through the Climate Pollution Reduction Implementation Grant funds. So to be eligible, that means you have to develop projects underneath one of the climate action plans. So the agency here, what they did is that the 67 largest cities represent about 197 million folks. So here in Georgia, where I live, and Atlanta is one of the MSAs of the largest 67. So the Atlanta metro area, if you look at the statistics, the metropolitan statistical area is actually 26 counties and a number of cities. And what EPA expected was that the local governments and jurisdictions within that MSA would come together to determine who would be the primary applicant that would deliver an MSA-wide climate action plan. So that, as we speak now, that those cities have until the end of April of maybe today, as a matter of fact, I think, or tomorrow, April 28th, to submit their notice of intent to participate, that they accept the money, and then based upon that funding, that they will deliver a work plan and agree to do a metropolitan area-wide climate action plan. If you go back and look on site, you'll see that on the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant site, that you'll see the list of the cities that have so far accepted and who those entities are. So again, the reason I mentioned that, particularly those that are within the 67 largest MSAs, that as they work on those climate action plans, since it includes materials management, sustainability, waste management, and decarbonization of material supply chains, that having a seat at the table on those climate action plans is really important, because that's how you become eligible to access and develop projects that could be funded through the $4.6 billion fund. The second piece of this was the states were each given $3 million So here you see the kind of the strategy that's underway. If you look at Georgia again, that the metropolitan area, is primarily Democratic. They're going to get their funding through this, but the state decided not to accept the $3 million to do a climate action plan. Then the cities outside of the Atlanta metropolitan area would not be eligible to be able to compete for those grants because they wouldn't be underneath a climate action plan. And that was in the guidance. So each of the states had until the end of March that was 30 days to decide whether or not to accept the money. I'll be happy to tell you, for example, Alabama was one of the first states to accept. So it's not necessarily maybe what people would think. But certainly in the end, 46 of the 50 states, including with Puerto Rico and DC, did accept the money. And they have until tomorrow to submit a work plan and budget to the agency for review for developing a statewide climate action plan that would be that provides the eligibility for all cities and communities outside of the large metro areas, including those within the metro areas, if they prefer to apply underneath the statewide plan. So the 4 states that did not accept were Kentucky, Florida, Iowa, and South Dakota. Iowa, South Dakota, probably because of the renewable fuels, and as we know, the agricultural subsidies they get for ethanol production and biofuels, and then Florida probably because of politics, and Kentucky I just don't really know. So as we speak right now, that means the work plans are due from the states. The MSAs have to submit their notice of intent to participate by the end of April. Then they have until the end of May to submit their work plan. EPA will take about 3 months to probably review. So that means that the states or the MSAs have about 5 to 6 months to develop a climate action plan across jurisdictions that then become, when they start rolling out the competitive grants, make that eligible for being able to compete for the $4.6 billion. So the last thing, and because I know we don't have that much time left, about another 12 minutes in my part of the presentation, that well, let me come back up here first. I do want to, again, just kind of touch on 2 things with this. On the program objectives, remember it says municipalities to work together on comprehensive pathways for reducing pollution, and then around transformative and scalable decarbonization efforts. So I want you to kind of connect those dots. So they're looking at how jurisdictions work better together, and then to ensure investments maximize benefits for communities is the other piece of this. So it's community-based and centered about providing that capacity, that building community development opportunities around what? Decarbonization. So if you read between the lines, what the agency is saying, and if we look across the broader perspective of what they call flexible planning resources, that at least the intent here is that once these climate action plans are in place, it could be also a way for other programs underneath the Inflation Reduction Act that go beyond just the climate programs, that could that become a way of coordinating those efforts through these climate action plans for eligibility as well as criteria in terms of meeting scalable decarbonization efforts. So I think there is an intent here to go beyond just the climate pollution reduction grants for sure within the agency, but I think it's also a broader interagency approach and part of the White House Environmental Justice Task Force and CEQ around really looking at coordinating the Inflation Reduction Act through climate action plans as part of a concerted strategy. So decarbonization efforts using this planning resource for a wide spectrum of funding opportunities. And as part of this decarbonization efforts, it includes what? Material management infrastructure, particularly community-based infrastructure. So the other thing I want you to point out that there is another fund right behind us from EPA. It's called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. This is a $27 billion fund, which is much bigger, but it's to leverage private capital for clean energy and clean air investments. But you'll notice in there that 20 billion of that is for the leverage private capital and competitive grants for community financing institutions through and to eligible nonprofit entities. In other words, this is a way of financing at the community level in cooperation and co-creating with local governments, bringing new financing tools around decarbonization, where communities become the economic engine for decarbonization, which includes decarbonization of materials and how we keep materials within communities as a circular perspective as part of community development that would be eligible for some of this financing money, and developing these institutions, if you want to call that, of being able to have communities actually finance their own community development around decarbonization. Over Earth Day, the agency came out with a little bit, another guidance, a second piece to the guidance, where they're actually breaking it into the actual types of funds that will be out there. There's also a $7 billion fund for solar and utility scale solar at the community level. That would be a way for some of this investment capital we're talking about to go in there. But there's also they broke out the 20 billion into a 14 billion and a $6 billion fund. The idea is 2 or 3 national nonprofits, private with private capital. So I want you to think about that 14 billion. I had a conversation with one of the CDFI Opportunity Fund Network. And as part of the Opportunity Fund Network, they're bringing 40 billion of equity they want to bring to the table to work with community-based nonprofits and organizations as part of community development that would be leveraged through that $14 billion. So just through that one, if they become one of the national nonprofits working or in partnership with a national nonprofit or as a hub nonprofit, which means they would represent some regional interest of deploying investment or finance money, that they can bring that equity to the table on, around, as they say, community development finance institutions and green banks or endowment funds, or and to ensure community institutions have the ability to finance pollution reducing projects, which include what? Circular economy, infrastructure, businesses, and opportunities. So with that, I just leave this with you that under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that this framework right now that I just mentioned to you, released on Earth Day, that it's open for public comment through, if you want to participate in one of the webinars this week, later, I think we're too late this week, but for next week, and talk about things like the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator on the role of materials and have those comments heard by EPA. There'll be an opportunity to give a 3-minute verbal comment next week on how the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is actually deployed as well. So with that, I just maybe want to just circle back around and let you know that what this is about is building capacity at the community level by having local governments work and co-create and design solutions for community opportunities for decarbonization that includes sustainable materials management, recycling and reuse, and repair as fundable projects for underneath climate action plans for these bigger pots of money. That's the kind of the takeaway message. And the question is, for folks as we're talking here, is both the role of communities as well as material management interests and organizations, and how do we have a seat at the table or not in the development of the 47 state climate action plans, as well as the 67, now actually 71, since we have some states that maybe even be more than 71, some states that decline the money. That means it goes down to the next largest MSAs in those states. As they develop these climate action plans, do they include materials and materials management and recycling as part of these plans and strategies for eligibility for these 31.6 billion in funding that are going to come through these other programs starting in January of 2024. So the last thing I just want to point out to you, I've got about 5 minutes left. I just want to give you an idea that, this is an area I'm working on around community-based circularity. I'm on the board of Life Cycle Building Center, so we're actually looking at reusing building materials, and we're using circularity of decarbonization and embodied carbon around building materials that we know are, one of the largest impacts, both environmentally, but we're using those materials to do energy efficiency improvements and workforce development for energy efficiency that link up with climate action planning for what? Clean energy deployment. So one of the grants we worked on through EPA Sustainable Material Management is a Breaking Barriers Deconstruction Workforce Plan for deconstruction that also included sustainable skills for facility management and construction services that are going to be reinvesting those materials back into community. So we're actually working with a community foundation, as you can see here, the Grove Park Foundation, which, remember when I said this financing money that could come down through CDFIs? Well, this is a version of a community development finance institution that we're looking at doing and reusing and deconstructing materials, that those materials get reused into doing energy efficiency improvement. Now we've started training the workforce to do that. So now we've built a new coalition that has 24 nonprofits in Atlanta West End with the Community Development Org and with the city and an anchor institution, Georgia Tech, where we're actually using reused materials to do energy efficiency improvement in legacy housing and subsidized housing, as along with energy efficiency retrofits that then lead to community solar once we get homes performing well within these underserved and impacted communities. And this coalition it brings circular economy applications around reusing building materials and embodied carbon to do energy burden reduction in subsidized and legacy housing that then link into and are competitive for some of the climate pollution reduction grants and some of the other funding around clean energy. And this coalition you see that's led by the Life Cycle Building Center as a community built asset on circularity, and this that brought the coalition together just won a DOE prize, Clean Energy Prize, one of 10 in the country. We are now competing for phase 2 of the prize for another 150,000, where we're actually going to do the retrofits using the breaking barrier skills we developed, and people that are working for both institutions that have deconstruction skills that can get more materials into the center, as well as being able to do construction services and weatherization and energy retrofits as new entrepreneurs or working as supporting subsidized housing landlords that are all living in the community anyway, and to be able to do these improvements on these properties. And these are the type of coalitions that you can build, that in part this is being built out of some of the environmental justice money. And so we expect that this coalition will also be reaching out to and being part of one of our partners in this is the West Side Watershed Alliance is definitely one of the partners that's going to be accessing technical assistance through the TIC centers I mentioned, as well as probably competing and getting some of the thriving community grant makers funding for additional capacity development to be able to do more of this work at the local level. So I just wanted to throw that out as an example. So with that, I think I'm at the end of my time. So I wanted to now, I guess, shift it over, Wayne, back to you, or back to Christine to kind of do a little bit deeper dive on the conversation I know, Christine, me and you've had, and how you have kind of taken this information and moved it forward in the state of Hawaii.
Yes, thank you, Jay. A great presentation. So we do have some questions already, but we're going to wait until to the end of Christine's presentation. So I'm going to introduce her. Christine Kabat is born and raised in rural Pennsylvania. She's a 40-year resident of Hawaii who lives in Hilo in close proximity to her 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Christine comes to the NRC board with a lifetime of involvement in environmental and social justice and activism. She currently serves as executive director of Recycle Hawaii, where she puts a wide-ranging background in politics, advocacy, journalism, project management, and community outreach in service to the organization's mission. So it's all yours, Christine.
Aloha, everyone. Well, I think it would be good if we just kind of took a breath because that was a lot of information from Jay. And honestly, I know him well enough to be able to say he could have gone for another 30 minutes at that pace, delivering equally relevant information. But the good news is you don't have to know everything Jay knows, and you don't have to remember everything he said to get actively involved in this process. So that's what I'm here to talk about. It is really good to be in touch with Jay, and I know that he is willing to give presentations, at the state level, because we're already going to be tapping into him to do that. But yeah, early on at the National Recycling Coalition level, Jay and I are both board members. I learned about this opportunity. I did exactly what Jay told me. I went right out as soon as I heard this was coming. I found which agency in our state of Hawaii was going to be developing the work plan. Well, first I wanted to find out, did we opt in? Of course we did, because we're good that way. And then I found out which agency was going to be developing the work plan. And I contacted them maybe within days of them themselves knowing that they were going to be part of this. So right up at the beginning, and have been included in this core group that's advising. It's the Hawaii State Climate Commission. We have an entity like that that's responsible for developing the work plan, and got drawn right in, a lot of it because it was early on. But as Jay has been saying, there's a real true emphasis on community development. We're a nonprofit community-based organization with a 30-year legacy. So we certainly fit the criteria and the description of what EPA is looking at in terms of a community-based asset. So so far, we have developed our work plan. I believe it's already been submitted. Most of the people on the working group are either affiliated with the university. There is Recycle Hawaii Art Organization. There's another maybe 2 or 3 organizations that are more community-based. But again, we're there right from the beginning. So we've already shifted from our work plan, which has been submitted, to starting to work on what's called the Priority Climate Action Plan. And as Jay described, this is a stepwise process. So first the state had to opt in, then the state had to develop a work plan, then the state now is going to, or the metropolitan statistical area is going to move on to developing the Priority Climate Action Plan. And I'll just go back a little bit, backtrack a little bit to say that, in our work plan, I don't feel like it would be appropriate for me to get into too much detail because I'm not sure how the Climate Commission here in Hawaii would feel that that information is proprietary or should be closely held. But I will say that our work plan is all about community outreach, 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 outreach. And to the extent that you can do that for yourself, or you can be instrumental to your state in doing that within your own community, I would really advise that. Here we are, Hawaii, we're a very small state. We got the same 3 million that everyone else did. Not too hard for us to take that 3 million over the next several years. And again, it is a 3-year, so that $3 million stretches out over 3 years because the work planning is ongoing. Easy for us to spend that money and do a really good job at community outreach. But if you're coming from a large state, you got the same $3 million, then my first recommendation to you would be to go out and organize in the community as much as you can and build the kind of coalitions that Jay is talking about. Because when you get into the process, you come with all of that capacity already. Then another thing that I noticed in the work plan, like this was a requirement that came from the EPA, was they want to see data collection. They want to see what did they call it? An inventory, the greenhouse gas inventory. So again, that's something in our state in Hawaii we're very actively working on. We have a lot of that information in our work plan. We would be updating or perfecting that analysis somehow. But that's going to be the two things that, well, in our response to the EPA and what they were looking for, those were the two things that we talked about was, getting our greenhouse gas inventory and understanding what level of climate pollution we're at now at this point, identifying the major sectors in our economy that are producing those greenhouse gases, and then organizing on the community. So then moving forward, my understanding, again, you have to put this in the context of this is what we in Hawaii do, and our state is very different in so many ways. But our understanding is that in the priority climate action plan, it wouldn't specifically say like, okay, Citizens for Recycling is going to do this project and they need this much money. It's not going to get into that level of detail, that there would be priorities organized around the impact that they would have on climate emissions. So you could very well imagine if you're into materials management, you would want to focus on things like organics, and then also reducing the carbon footprint of your collection systems, maybe collecting materials and keeping them close to home, things like that. But that these things would be included as priorities in a general sense. And I'm already keeping my eyes out and trying to track, is there going to be some point where my organization, Recycle Hawaii, will have to drop out of this process due to a potential conflict of interest? I know it's fine now because everything is very general, and it's good to have the actual recycling organizations and the community-based organizations that would be receiving funds there, helping to guide the process. But it might very well be that as this progresses, there's some point where my organization would have to drop out because, we would be making decisions, or we would be influencing decisions, I would say more, that would have a direct benefit to us. So just kind of keep that in mind. And if you have an organization that's like a coalition and is well funded on its own and can get in there and represent all of the different community-based kind of hands-on groups that would be receiving the funding or that would hope to receive the funding, then that might be a better strategy for you, especially in a bigger state. So what's next? Yeah, if you're engaged in this, so find out what is the entity in your state that's developing. By the time you get to it, it's going to be the priority climate action plan, because the work plan will have already gone in. See how you can be helpful. And what I'm imagining from my experience is, again, the most helpful thing you can do is start to identify community assets and be very creative in your thinking about this. This might be high school students. As an example, we have a program here in Hawaii Island. It's modeled after the shark tank, but we're very peaceful people, so it's a fish tank. And then there are young people and they come up with ideas. This is all like a STEM-based learning. They have ideas, and these are definitely coming up from the grassroots. They're students and they're thinking about in their communities. And so if there's a way to engage students and to tap into ongoing projects like this where young people are looking at decarbonization, I think that would be a really good thing to do as well. Also, I would recommend to look around in your community and see if there's some sort of legacy of environmental injustice, because we know that's a priority. So for instance, if there's a place where there's been a landfill and it's unlined and it's been there for a long time, you would want to do some outreach there and find out like what kinds of ideas these people have about either closing that landfill or preventing new materials from going into it. Because again, it's going to be competitive. You can imagine with $4.6 billion, every state's going to get something. We're telling ourselves that. But it is going to be competitive. And so, to the extent that you can help deal with existing environmental injustice, I think that will definitely, increase the competitiveness of your proposal. Let's see. Yeah, the transformative and scalable decarbonization efforts. A lot of this sounds very wonky. So another thing I think you could do as people who understand materials management is to take all this information that Jay's been sharing and find ways to describe it that folks in your community can understand and relate to. I know a term that we like to use a lot is waste to wealth. That comes from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and other contacts that we've made. But I think that helps people to understand, how these materials that are going into the landfill, they're generating greenhouse gas emissions, or it's taking a lot of, like a big carbon footprint to even move them around. How can they be held within communities as resources and be used to, not only displace the import of products that have come with their own new carbon footprint, but how they can be used to build wealth. So I think those are some of the, main points that I wanted to cover. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So far, I've just found a real openness in terms of, having people like me working at the nonprofit grassroots level to get engaged in this process. We're excited about it. It's a little bit confusing because there's all these other pots of money coming through Swiffer and, different places. I'm not exactly sure. Jay might have some ideas about how to kind of navigate that or prioritize it. But in general, doors wide open, get in there, get your seat at the table, help prioritize, the kinds of things you want to see, and think outside the box. In closing, I'll just share this as an example. We had a discussion 2 days ago with the Director of Environmental Management here on our island. So this is like at the municipal level, the agency that handles waste. And we have these vast subdivisions, well, vast for Hawaii, that were developed with no infrastructure. And at the time, it made that land affordable for a lot of people who couldn't ever dream of owning their own home. But, there were no roads and there's no water system and there's definitely no waste collection. And so now we're looking at, well, hey, what if we within those subdivisions find a place that materials could come as a kind of a first cut. So here's something you don't want anymore, you take it there. And the first opportunity is for someone else within that community to go and have access to it and make use of it themselves. And then later, whatever's left could then get transported to what we call transfer stations here. So I think the closer your idea is to the community and giving them access to materials, I feel like, you'll have a better chance of actually getting funding. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Christine. So we're now going to field some questions for our presenters. We do have some in the queue already. So if you do have a question or comment, please use the Q&A feature on your computer. So I think there's some questions here on eligibility. We have questions from state universities, for-profit businesses, school districts, and the like. So how do they fit in with this program as far as eligibility and partnership, I guess, with an eligible entity?
Well, so the idea, I think, as we're seeing this kind of play out, one is that at least certainly some of the capacity building grants, the idea of what we call anchor institutions, which could include a state higher ed or university as part of working with convening and connecting communities as a resource. they could be a partner with community-based organizations that apply for this funding. I will tell you that from what I've seen, at least out of the EJ grants, is it's really, the primary applicants is really the push of being the community-based organization, but they could certainly have an institution or a larger nonprofit work with them to help them develop the good projects as a partner with them. And then there is some money that's going to come through local governments, which could include state or local and states, which could include state universities, could include a school system that, again, but the idea is they're going to work with community-based organizations on either capacity development or project implementation. So I think, the way I would look at it, the focus is on working and building and co-creating, designing solutions with community-based organizations, community-based nonprofits. If you want to see how that's defined, you can certainly look at the environmental justice government to government grant and the EJ collaborative grants that just recently closed. They have a definition of community-based organization in that. In terms of for-profits, I think that's going to be one where for-profits is going to be working with and through community-based organizations as they do things. I mean, that's part of what we're talking about on some of the clean energy work, for example, of, community-based economic development around entrepreneurships of new businesses to deliver these services that would be eligible and could be funded through and with some of the, community development corporations, for example, as part of a community-wide effort, or just in, as a seed to bring some other private equity money to the table that can build local capacity to deliver these services. But in terms of a for-profit actually applying for this funding, I don't see that. That's not a typical EPA program, but I would tell you that, again, this is just a small look through the window of Inflation Reduction Act grants, that there probably are a number of them designed specifically around technology innovation and working with for-profit entities. So I'm not saying that it isn't, it's just not typically within very few programs within EPA's bandwagon to do that, at least within the series of grants that I just presented today. So hopefully that helps.
And yeah, I would to that the opportunities I see for universities or those kinds of institutions are around, first of all, on different campuses, if you have students who are organizing as a climate action group or whatever, and they have ideas for programs like on-campus programs, I think those would fare rather well. I also think to the extent that the university is engaged and involved in workforce development, that would be another angle. And then, as I said, what we're seeing in our work plan, there's a component for greenhouse gas inventory, for data collection. So to me, those would be the different maybe opportunities for universities. But again, whether or not the money would go directly to the university or it would go through some community-based organization, that's not entirely clear. If you do have a climate action group on campus, they might already be organized as a nonprofit. So those would be some ideas.
Yeah, and some of the grants right now, like the grant makers grants, it's actually linkages of higher ed institutions throughout a region that are coming together as a concerted entity. And again, like the work we did with Georgia Tech, at the Life Cycle Building Center, they were a partner providing capacity to community-based organizations around convening and other resources to help build these good projects, was the way that played out. The last thing I would tell you we're doing is also really trying to highlight the value of what we call four-year undergrad schools, not the big research universities, because the four-year undergrad schools, at least in Georgia, the ones that are charged by the Board of Regents of providing workforce development, sustainable skill development at the community level every day, particularly for first-generation students and other things. So we're trying to bring them to the table and make sure they're getting the resources that they need in partnership with the big research institutions as part of a community-driven and based approach. So there's some complexities to this, but there's some real opportunities at higher ed of being anchor institutions at the community level, but through a network of institutions working better together.
Okay, this one is sort of a comment looking for a confirmation. So it's pretty long, so bear with me. On CPRG, materials projects will need to compete with energy and transportation projects. So they need to show large GHG emissions reductions. Most of the emissions reductions are due to reducing upstream consumption emissions, which are excluded from typical GHG inventories. Parentheses, waste is less than 10% of inventories, and parentheses. Seems like materials proposals need to address upstream prevention to have a big impact, and need to add scope 3 upstream emissions in these metro/state baseline inventories. Does this seem correct to you?
So,
Wow.
yeah, so I'm going to say yes and no. I do think we do need to, be able to make the case for that. Now, again, you notice when I put up the climate chart up there, did you see any of EPA's land and material programs in there? No, they weren't. Why? Because traditionally, they've never sat at the climate table in a real meaningful way. Just going to be blunt about it. Same thing happens at local level. A lot of times they're really focused on these broader energy conversations. The change here under the climate pollution reduction grants is they really broaden that, and they're looking at it from this broader decarbonization, but they put it from the context at the community level. So I think that, as we look at things like zero waste programs and all that, and this infrastructure for circularity materials at a community level, that I think they can make a pretty good argument and be pretty competitive for funding. The question will be whether or not they can, within those that typically write climate action plans, typically have the kind of conversation that was just mentioned on all the different scope of emissions versus looking at it from a community development perspective. And that's part of what the agency is trying to encourage through this. So the answer is yes, you need to look at and making a compelling case for pollution or emissions reduction, but it may be also looking at it from a community level of, is it providing access to, community wealth generation, as well as causing less, local impact on, the relation of those emissions at locally versus looking at these broader life cycle perspectives, which I'm not sure will be as fundable underneath these grants, quite frankly. But
I would.
Jay, as a follow-up to that, though, isn't it key to getting materials management written into the climate action plans
absolutely
as one of the targets? If they're not written into the climate action plans, then
right.
You won't be competing.
Right.
So isn't that a critical part?
Yeah, that's why I said yes and no. Right. What I'm saying is it goes beyond just the scope 3 and the other emissions. It's also what are the environmental impacts and qualities at the community level, and is it part of providing and improving both environmental and community development opportunities, and around sustainability and resiliency is going to be just as important as part of how these plans get designed and implemented, because in the end it's about funding going to community-based organizations.
So what I would say about that, though, is that's not the greatest opportunity for materials management to be included in these funding streams. And the greatest opportunity is around organics, because of the methane emissions in the landfill, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas. So we have a very strong argument to make that this should be a priority to get organics out of the landfill.
Yeah.
And then again, the other thing is the carbon footprint of moving these materials. We see a lot of places where people would like to recycle or to manage materials better, but because it takes so much energy and transportation fuels are so costly right now, then that doesn't happen. So there's a huge transportation component to any kind of business planning or funding of recycling options or operations. And to me, those would be the two things, like for materials management, if you were really going to focus on organics out of the landfill, and also reducing the carbon footprint of moving materials, then
and
you're
buildings.
And also the embedded carbon in building materials, you would have, your proposal would be more competitive. But because we're really focused on upstream, like people like us who are really trying to find true solutions and not just deal with materials at the end of the life stream, then yeah, you would want to focus on upstream innovations. Include that, please, because that's helpful to the wider movement. But your most competitive grant applications are going to be around organics diversion.
Yeah, and let me just mention on the, life cycle building center and the embodied carbon and wood products is really important because the state of Georgia is investing in decarbonization through mass timber and embedded carbon within timber. Georgia and the Southeast are the largest states for forestry. They're looking at developing a whole set of new products that actually are carbon negative and new structures, and then capturing that embedded carbon at end of life and reinvesting that back in the community is a really important carbon reduction strategy that you can articulate in a pretty compelling way, I think.
I think we have time for one more question. Does decarbonization efforts include reduction of other non-carbon based greenhouse gas emissions like methane or refrigerant leaks? Or is this that only covered by the GHG reduction fund?
That's a good question. A couple things. Yeah. Well, one thing with that, I would tell you there are some programs for methane emissions reduction. Those are regulatory programs. That was actually in one of the slides that I showed that from a regulatory approach that is certainly out there that, is going to help, drive some changes. But, I think that, again, if you can find ways to better manage and we're causing and reducing and improving air quality and reducing pollution at the community level, then, I would think there would be some eligibility for that, or it'd be, it isn't just, doesn't have to be just quote decarbonization. There are certainly states that are going to be looking at this from a climate pollution reduction standpoint versus climate action. But certainly the agency's intent is to drive this through climate action planning and decarbonization and development of communities around those principles is probably the significant piece of what's the intent is of some of these programs and the way they're being pieced together. That makes sense.
Okay. All right. So we're out of time. Apologize for not getting to all the questions, but maybe we can do some follow-up there. So again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and the Recycling Market Center websites. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Jay and Christine and Gary for your input and your presentations. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us on future webinars. And please visit our websites for schedule updates. So have a great day, everybody.